brother just told me. Jay, why are we laughing so much? How many years, John?
I started teaching Hamlet when Lyndon Johnson was president.
And she says, I met the youthful Lord Paris at Lawrence's cell and gave him what becoming love I might, not overstepping the bounds of modesty.
No, I already did that with the other
I should
guy.
say not.
Him and Beowulf and...
But you know, when he dies, he's like desperate to be remembered. Tell my story. Remember me.
Should we be doing this? Should we stop right now?
No.
All right. Hey, Jay. Good to see you again. How you doing tonight?
Really great. I'm excited to return to the Odyssey. And we have one of those chapters that if you were reading this epic really fast, you'd either skip, summarize, or be very surface level. And as we've said throughout, and if you're listening, if you're teaching this particularly, either teach it or don't teach it. Don't half teach it. It's not, it'll give people a bad taste in their mouths for what this is. Actually do it. Like, dig in. There is stuff. We talked about the laundry chapter. There's stuff there. This is a chapter you could skim over. Don't skim over it. Take your time. So this is going to be good, I think.
I totally agree. And I hear from my students, I haven't taught the Odyssey at the school I'm at now, and they tell me that the teacher who taught it with them skipped around and, only got the important chapters. And I just put my fingers in my ears. I can't take it. I'm like, I almost just stop everything and say, all right, drop it, get your copies out. We're starting going through. But this is a test chapter for the approach you are describing. 14 is not a highly anthologized chapter, to say the least. Yep. However, it's a strong chapter. It's great. I think that our model, Jay, will work. Our normal outline, obvious and essential, subtle but crucial, and then lingering questions will work for this chapter as well. And then it's a place to spend a little time and not skip over. So if you are teaching the Odyssey or thinking about teaching the Odyssey, settle in and listen as we talk through this. Jay and I have been through this many times with lots of different students who read it, lots of different levels, really. Yeah. From our sort of calculus level readers down to our pre-algebra level readers, so to speak. Yeah. And we've been able to take students, students across that sort of through chapters like this one and help them find their way through it and really be inspired by it. So there is inspiration in this. There's comfort in it. There's kind of a pleasure in it. So let's jump in. But before we do, Jay, do you have a poem for us for tonight?
I do, and I just have to give a little background. So Eumaeus is the central character to a large extent in Book 14. We're going to get to him, but he takes care of Odysseus's pigs. And Eumaeus was the son of the king of Syria, and Eumaeus's nurse, the woman who took care of him, took him on a boat, was sort of enticed by Phoenician pirates, and Artemis, the goddess, killed Eumaeus's nurse. Eumaeus ended up getting purchased by Odysseus's father. So Eumaeus's own story was that of just high adventure. I mean, royalty and kidnapping and goddess warfare and homelessness and being bought and sold. Yeah. So I think that's important as we get to Book 14. I was looking around for poems about homelessness, and I found this poem by Juliet Kono that I had never read, and it's incredibly moving, and it's about her son who's homeless. And I wanted to share this. It's called Homeless by Juliet Kono, Kono, Homeless. My son lives on the streets. We don't see each other much. Like a mother who puts white lilies on the headstone of a dead child, I put money into his bank account, clothes in an easy access storage, and pretend he's far away at a boarding school or in a foreign country. Nights I dream fairy tales about him. I dream he becomes a prince, scholar, or warrior who rescues me from sorrow the way he rescued me when he was a child and said, "Mommy, don't cry. and brought tea into the room of his father's acrimony, brave, standing tall in the forest fire of his father's scorn. I wake to the empty sound of wind in the trees. He says he wants to live with me. I say I can't live with him, boy whose words crash like branches in a rainstorm. Nothing can hold him in, the walls of a house too thin. Back home, I had seen the study hard so you don't become like them street bums on Mammo Street, and he is like them. These days, in order to catch a glimpse of him, I circle the city. One day I see him on his bike. People give him wide berth, the same way birds avoid power lines, oncoming cars, or trees. I park on a side street. Wild-eyed, he flies the block as if in a holding pattern. Not of my body, not of my hopes. He homes in on what can't be given or taken away.
Homeless by Juliet Kono.
Yep.
Wow. There's a lot there to think about.
Oh my gosh. Well, as parents, Paul, it's I don't even want to think about it.
No.
But Eumaeus had a father and a mother.
Yeah.
You know? And he's somewhere else. You know, and as noble, he's as noble as a character gets, and I would argue all of Homer. I just finished rereading the Iliad too. Doesn't get more noble, doesn't get more good, doesn't get more quintessentially Greek, one could argue.
No.
But he's to a large extent homeless. He's away from his home.
Yeah.
Bought and sold.
And he's still mourning. He's mourning for the loss of his own personally adopted parents, essentially, is what he says. He mourns for the lost Odysseus more than his own parents, he says. He's come to do. And you can see it in everything he says and everything he does, from the beginning of the chapter right up to the end, in the dark night, out under a rock that pigs take comfort under. I don't know if you say happy to do it, but he dutifully does it. Unquestionably does it with dignity, it's a deep portrayal of dignity without the boring explanation. Well, thank you for that poem, Homeless. It's worth checking out. I'd like to check that out again. I've never read that poem either. Well, let's dig in. We are moving through, as you know, if you've been following along, we're moving through all 24 books of the Odyssey. I'm reading the Robert Fitzgerald's translation and going through that. The chapter 14 book title is Hospitality in the Forest. Jay is going through the Emily Wilson translation, the fairly recent Emily Wilson translation, which is also good, and I've taught and enjoyed enormously. What title does she have for?
A Loyal Slave.
A Loyal Slave. All right. I like that. Loyal Slave. So that is book 14. Let's lay it out in our outline form. That's what's obvious in this chapter and essential, and then we'll move to the subtle part, the part that we think is subtle but crucial, the part you might miss, but you shouldn't. So why don't we open up with obvious and essential in this chapter? Jay, you want to open us up? What did you land on there?
Yeah, I guess this is one of those chapters where I do give my kids a pre-engagement question, and I ask them if they think about books 1 through 13 of the Odyssey. We make a list, not of who we've been paying attention to, but what kinds of people, what kinds of characters have had a voice. So they say gods and men. Fine. So gods. But I say, what kind of human beings? And Eurycleia, the nurse, who's also property, had a voice early, but for the most part, it's either upper class humans or gods. And what I encourage them to think about is, during a day at school, who has a voice and who doesn't? Do they feel that freshmen have a voice like seniors have a voice? Do they feel that older teachers have a voice different than younger teachers? Do they feel that custodians and cafeteria work? So I'd like them to think about just their daily lives and to think about who they hear from and who they don't hear from, who they know about and who they don't know about. And I'd like that just because it maybe conditions them to be kind of open to this chapter a bit. I don't know if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, no,
That's
that
not
does.
answer the question. It's more of like a conditioning
Yes, it does, and it's an interesting way to read the story. I don't find class consciousness in Homer or in Odysseus. Let's say within the story in Odysseus. I don't know. I hadn't thought about this before. I don't. An easy example doesn't come to mind of it for Odysseus. It's certainly not in this chapter. And in fact, I think I really want to kind of end up or kind of close off with comments related to that in my sort of lingering questions that are really related to the worldview that's presented here. This Greek sort of perspective, because Odysseus's perspective on himself is certainly not regal or upper class at all. Eumaeus, who we find is really smart and perceptive in the story. Clearly, he doesn't suss out that he's talking to some upperclassmen. He hasn't found like you find in India or Britain. They say locals can talk to each other for 30 seconds and they know whether a person is above them in class or beneath them in class, and that's always in their mind as well to figure out who am I talking to, but not here in this. I don't find that in this chapter. We're just talking about reality, about life. But to your point, I don't think our students, once you bring it up at all, it's very easy for them to find it in the chapters, because I think it's natural for them to ask, what is Odysseus doing here, prostrating himself to a swineherd? It doesn't seem right. It's so unexpected.
No, that's true. And I know I don't want to get on a tangent, but I think it's a relevant one, that for me, the most dynamic reading experiences are ones in which anyone can have power and agency in really surprising ways.
Yeah.
I think Harold Goddard or Harold Bloom, I forget which Harold, called it the democracy of Shakespeare. That women in the comedies, underprivileged characters like the Gravedigger and 5-1 of Hamlet, the list goes on, right?
Yeah, that's probably Goddard. I think that's Goddard, because that's the name of his book, is Shakespeare for Everybody, or Shakespeare for Everyone. That's the name of one of his books.
And I think in terms of novelists, it would be Dickens, certainly. But even in novelists that you don't think would be democratic, Jane Austen has surprising moments of that. And so anyway, I find that I find the reading experience of anything greatly enhanced when anybody can matter. And I think this is a chapter where that idea pops, even in something 3,000 years old. Homer's natural universe is that way, and his human universe is that way, and his divine universe is that way, where you never know what's going to matter. And I think that would make it brutally difficult to live inside of, but it makes it a great reading experience. So in terms of answering your question, I just have a couple of short nuggets from early in book 14. Just a short passage of Odysseus meeting Eumaeus, and then what I refer to as Eumaeus's theology. And I think these two things are essential because they set us up for everything about Eumaeus. And also Odysseus's early moments returning home. This is in the Wilson, it's line 36, but Eumaeus has these vicious guard dogs. And Eumaeus the swineherd, the guard dogs attack Odysseus, who's in disguise. And Eumaeus says, "My dogs almost ripped you apart, old man." I don't think Odysseus needs to be told that since it just happened. But anyway, oh, really? That's what happened? Eumaeus says, "You would have brought me shame when the gods are hurting me already." That's interesting. "I am in mourning for an absent master, raising his pigs for other men to eat. My lord is lost." Obviously, the dramatic irony. I'll have my students write DI in the margins whenever there's dramatic irony. "My lord is lost and maybe even hungry." I love that detail, because Eumaeus isn't just theoretically wondering about not just his lord, the guy who owns him, like you and I own our house.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
He's not only worried about him, it's like my Nana's, think of have you eaten? Right? I think of my Nana, the fattest man in the world could have walked into my grandmother's house. "You look thin. You look hungry. Have a sandwich. Have some. Let me make you. You want a pie? I'll make you a whole pie." There's this sense that, like, this man loves Odysseus like a relative, almost like a maternal relative. So maybe even hungry, in lands where the people speak in foreign tongues. So here's what I'm worried about. My lord is lost. He's hungry. and he's scared in a foreign place, a place where they don't know him, they don't love him, they don't understand him, they don't take care of him. So the worry about him is layered. It isn't a general worry, it's a layered, specific worry. If he's still alive, still seeing the sunlight. And then he says to Odysseus, follow me, old man, fill up on food and wine. Tell me then where you come from, the troubles you have borne. Now, the rules of Xenia is that you bathe the person, you feed the person, they sleep the night, and only then can you ask, who are they? Yeah. That's the way to go. But I have a sense, and I would love for anybody that knows more than I do to comment on this. Mm-hmm. I have a sense that because Eumaeus is poor, and all he has are probably some scraps of food, and he doesn't have the capacity to have Odysseus be bathed by a servant, and he doesn't have that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
This is probably what he has. This is probably similar to the passage in the New Testament where the poor woman like washes Jesus with her hair.
Yeah.
Maybe, or the woman who gives him like a couple of, like, that's more than a rich person could give. Like, that's everything she has. That's an analogous sort of passage to me. So that passage is really important. We're seeing a very new kind of like complete goodness here, a complete giving over, a complete generosity that like Menelaus didn't give.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is utter and complete. And then this is short on the next page, very short, just a few lines, line 54. So Odysseus says, the gods reward you, blah, blah. And Eumaeus says, and also Eumaeus is referred to as you by the poet. And I've been reading up on this because it happens in the Iliad sometimes too.
Again, what'd you find about that? I never really, it stands out, but I never really dug into it.
Part of me thinks, and I could be wrong, Paul, like part of me thinks, as my father said, I thought I was wrong once, but I made a mistake. Part of me thinks it's a way, it's sort of like epic similes are like Homer's way of, if he was making a movie, he would turn the soundtrack up and make it dramatic. He uses epic similes.
Interesting.
Part of me thinks this is another way of doing that. Like, this is a special moment. I am addressing you, a character, as if I almost know you, like you're special. And he's doing that with the guy who's literally owned by Odysseus, was owned by the father, now he's owned by Odysseus. He says, and you, Eumaeus, answered, Eumaeus says to Odysseus, one must honor guests and foreigners, xenos, right, and strangers, even those much poorer than oneself. Zeus watches over beggars and guests and strangers. So we get to book 14, and it seems like not only are we getting the model of what a good Greek is from a guy who's literally a piece of property.
Yeah.
Odysseus is reminded here of what a good Greek is. Odysseus hasn't always been one. Now, some of that might be to survive the moment, but the fact of the matter is, Odysseus is learning my people miss me, at least this guy does. Yep. He's also learning there might not be a lot of hope of my return, but maybe some part of him, I was wondering this, Paul, and I'd be curious to hear what you think. This might be a sign to Odysseus that there's hope in Ithaca, because if the piece of property that manages my pigs is this good a man, then maybe we can be okay.
Yeah. No, that hands off nicely into what I tried to capture is obvious and essential is essentially that, Jay, is that there is nobility and goodness. There is nobility and goodness to be fought for. So if we're coming back in end of Odysseus, he doesn't even recognize his home place. In book 13, as you recall, he's just landed in Ithaca for the first time. That chapter title is One More Strange Island in the Fitzgerald translation. It's a strange place. So this is like digging into that, what was physically strange to him. He didn't recognize, the landscape of the place. Now maybe we're wondering, is this home, in any meaningful sense? This is a place that I recognize. Do people behave like they're supposed to? Do they respect the gods? Maybe even the unspoken question is it even worth fighting for? And so I think that sort of macro plot point that you kind of led into here is that it's true that there is, that we have an example in Eumaeus here, or not example, but a demonstration that there is still something to hope for here, something to fight for here, and it's found in a corner, in a far-flung corner. It's not in the palace. It's not amongst the noblemen. of the island. And we're going to meet the noblemen of the island, and they're not behaving well. But it's among this person who, who's a slave, who's had enormous amounts of hardship, who has every excuse in the book, if he wanted it, to be irresponsible, to just let everything fall apart. And he does, he does the opposite of that. So yeah, I think it's a good way to go. And I think it's a good way to approach the chapter. If you're trying to there's a lot of little details to fall into, but if you're trying to keep that big plot line across, in view, like how does this contribute to the next moves in the story? I think it does that very well. It's motivation. And you hear Odysseus internalizing a couple, lines throughout where he thinks, I'm going to get those guys. And it seems to be, seems to be working. It gears them up, to go down and put things right. I think it's a good thing to focus on, in this chapter. It's restrained. It's this slow burn, slow build that Homer has, throughout this kind of narrative control. I think, I would say in this story to build toward this crescendo ending, that's coming, but it makes you believe, along with Odysseus, that it's good to be back, and there's something, some glimmers of hope here amongst the rags and the loss and the suffering. Yeah. So I'd go along with that. Definitely.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
So that's good for obvious, sort of obvious and essential. I think you and I both kind of came together there in a on something common in that. So that you definitely want to pick up as you're coming into this book. Odysseus is newly back home. What's it like now when you get a chance to meet people here? What are they like? And what's my motivation for moving forward? Eumaeus represents that to the reader and to Odysseus as he's coming in. All right. So what's subtle in here? What's something a little bit beneath that kind of macro part of the narrative that's important to pick up on? Jay, do you have some subtlety?
Yeah, I have two things that, and it connects to my lingering question later, but two things that illustrate in really clear ways Eumaeus's not only loyalty to Odysseus, but his intimate knowledge of him.
Yeah.
Around line 100, he lists for Odysseus's property without knowing he's saying it to Odysseus. He says 12 herds of cattle on the mainland, 12 herds of sheep, 12 herds of pigs, 12 herds of goats. He said Odysseus had to hire more laborers to help us. And out here on the far end of the island, 11 herds of goats are grazing, watching by good men. Every day a herdsman takes whichever goat seems fattest and most healthy up to the palace. Now we know the subtext to serve to a bunch of gross suitors, right? He doesn't say that. I who watch these pigs must choose the best for them. The fact that he knows to the letter the specs of Odysseus's property is suggestive. And then a little bit later, he says about Odysseus, like speculating on Odysseus's fate, I miss him. I hesitate to call him by his name. I would prefer to call him brother. And I can't help but to think Odysseus owns him. He's not like if you and your wife hired a cleaning service to clean your house. Nope, that's not even remotely similar, even though those people look like they're in a different socioeconomic status, and they probably are. They are working for a company. You are paying them, hopefully, a just wage. That is utterly qualitatively different. Eumaeus is owned like you own your car. And he's saying, he's my brother, and he doesn't even know he's talking to Odysseus. Yeah. And I mentioned this, and it harkened me back to the great Band of Brothers speech from Henry V. And an underdiscussed reality in that speech is Henry is a king. And there's some nobles he's talking to, but there's also some privates he's talking to. People who aren't nobility. And he says, he who sheds his blood today with me shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. In other words, if you fight and are badass today and you're heroic today, you become a gentleman by your heroism, and we're brothers, right?
Yeah.
And he's using that term. We're band of brothers. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. He who sheds his blood with me, right?
Yeah.
Shakespeare almost, and I don't have a lot of evidence that Shakespeare he didn't know Greek really, and I don't think he knew Homer very well. But there's this sense that if someone who's a king wants to dramatically inspire, that sort of democratization is very dramatic.
Yeah.
Very dramatic. Now, interestingly, here it's a reverse democratization because the property is saying this person who owns me is my brother. It's fascinating. Like I'm fascinated by that.
Yeah, it is, and that relates to my lingering question, which I want to ask about, which I alluded to. It's fascinating. How is that? Because he's owned, and I think the sense we have of that though is somehow different, in this story, because you're not going to hear, and Eumaeus is not some kind of he's not trampled on, he's not walked on. He has throughout the story, and this is something to read for his nobility and the way he interacts with this beggar who shows up at his house. Eumaeus is smart. He's quick. He's witty. He's in control. He's 100% in control. He's competent. He knows, as you pointed out, he's been responsible all along. He knows Odysseus's herds down to the number of head. And so that's all part of his nobility, I guess, is what I'm saying. And at the same time, he does not complain about his station. What he complains about is injustice. What he complains about is that there are these people who are being irresponsible with his master's property, making it impossible for him to do what he knows he ought to do. What he complains about is that this man he loves and thinks of as a brother may be suffering somewhere in the world, and that's awful. That's some evil the gods may have poured down on his head, and that's what he wants to right. And in that sense, kind of like in the Henry V speech, he and Odysseus are on the same team. They want to bring back around the order that belongs, in the island, and that's what he wants, and he is going to participate in, as we'll see. So. Yep. Yeah, I like that, but it points to one of the things that's interesting about reading all really great books is it presents to you a view of the world that you don't have, that's lost, that you want to try to struggle through your own perspective to get and to add to, and to adumbrate your own view, as it were.
Yeah.
All right, that's good. That's good for subtle and crucial.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the subtlety part here, I was kind of tempted by the stories. So a lot of this chapter is taken up with Odysseus, the beggar, telling Eumaeus, because Eumaeus asks him, as he always do as a host, where did you come from? How did you get here? Who are your people? What's your mission? What's your journey? All this, which we've heard over and over throughout the book. Odysseus, of course, is quick with the story, and he makes up this whole tale. And his tale, as you go through it, it is interesting. It's worth paying attention to. And it's about a guy who goes to the Trojan War and comes back home. But this guy makes it back home immediately, even though the Greeks were scattered on the way back home. He says he makes it back to Crete, which is where he says he's home. But he's only home for a month, and then he's spoiling for action. He takes off again, and then there's this whole other adventure he tells about that he has in Egypt, and he's nearly killed, and he's nearly sold as a slave a couple times, but he gets out by luck and ends up here in Ithaca after spending 7 years in Egypt as something like a slave, I guess. He says. So there's something in that there, and I think I would encourage you as you read the book, maybe to read into that, to get insights into Odysseus and how he thinks about his own story. One of the obvious ones is Odysseus already, after he's home, does he think he'll stay home, or would he be bored once he gets back, like the Alfred Lord Tennyson poem Ulysses?
Yeah.
Sort of presents it. He's like, Telemachus can run this place. I gotta go, man. This is just not for me.
You can flyer miles. I'm good.
Yeah. I gotta spend them. They expire at the end of the year. But that's not. I guess I don't want to put that as a subtle and crucial. I kind of want to build off my obvious and essential and say that Eumaeus, for what benefits the plot in the long run, I think the better thing to notice, and the thing you'll appreciate in reading backwards, is to see Eumaeus as an example of how things ought to be on the island. So again, like the obvious and essential, that I put out, there is something to fight for. Eumaeus embodies it. Kind of building off of that, the subtle thing is that he exemplifies how things ought to be ordered, and he shows
Yep.
that it's good and that everyone can benefit, that it can be done. Even a swineherd can do it. So if he can do it, the nobleman can do it. And it also, just for the drama, it sets up the drama, because when you meet the people who ought to be doing it by all class rights, right? Like the quote unquote true gentry, on the island. And when they're not doing it, then it makes it seem really, really bad, which you need to feel, and you need to understand that, given what happens to them in the end. Not to spoil it, but it's ugly. And so you need to feel it. And so you feel it from the first scenes, really, of Odysseus on the island. And you're always thinking back when you're thinking, oh man, should that guy have been ripped, limb from limb? You think back to Eumaeus and like, no, he should have. He could have done it. He could have known. He should have known better. Eumaeus knew. So these noblemen who Odysseus is going to set right definitely could have known. So I guess I want to say that is see the example of piety, the example of duty, of respect, of nobility that everyone can have, in this society. And when the noble people, the people who are supposed to be the carriers of it, are not doing it, it's especially dark, especially bad. And Eumaeus embodies that, exemplifies that for us. So I kind of like that as my, sort of subtle point, for how this chapter kind of holds the book together, hold the plot together a little bit, I guess. So I don't know. I'm gonna go for that one, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, my lingering question is connected to that exact thing, and part of me wonders, not to spoil the ending, but folks have had 3,000 years to read this.
Yeah, I mean that's enough time. That's it.
Right.
It's not like it came out in the movies yesterday.
My students are finishing Beowulf for Friday, and they said, "How's it going to end?" And I said, "Well, it's interesting. He actually wakes up in a cupboard under the stairs on Privet Drive, and he gets his Hogwarts letter, and everybody's." But in Beowulf at Hogwarts became the conversation, and then the class just feared. It's amazing my class.
And that's why you're not through Beowulf yet. I understand.
Yeah. It's going to be like Valentine's Day, and we're still going to be having a dragon.
The quarter's over, Jay.
Yeah, it's fun. But I just can't help but to think, like, at the big apocalyptic battle at the end of the Odyssey, Eumaeus is the only person who one could argue is really choosing to fight for good, because it's usually either like Odysseus's family or a god, and Eumaeus is actually completely choosing this. And I think Eumaeus is maybe the most heroic character in the whole thing. You could argue the most heroic character in Homer. You could definitely argue the most heroic character in the Odyssey. He has the longest way to go to be heroic. My lingering question is largely connected to what you were saying, Paul, which is, in light of what we've been saying about the transparency of Eumaeus's loyalty and the transparency of his intimate knowledge of Odysseus's livelihood and property, his loyalty to Odysseus and Ithaca, it's unwavering. And Odysseus knows this because he doesn't know he's talking to Odysseus. Even though all of that's true, Odysseus doesn't tell him the truth. Now, his story is sort of peppered with truth that we know, but he's from Crete in the story, and interestingly, his story, which is full of kidnapping and pirates, is largely an echo of Eumaeus' story, which Odysseus would know because Odysseus' dad bought Eumaeus.
That's right. It really is.
Part of me wonders, like, why do that? Like, if you already know this guy is utterly loyal to you, why not say right now, look, sit down, Odysseus, here's the scar on my leg. We're going to do this thing. You have to be quiet for like a couple of days. We're going to have till him. So, and I don't like the answer because the book is 24 books long. That's not a legitimate answer. We'll say that, no, there's several chapters left and we have to draw it out. No, that's a bad answer. So I want to know, is Odysseus lying because he's still in sort of war defense mode where he struggles trusting people? Well, that's fine. I don't blame him considering everything he's been through. But think of what Eumaeus has already said, and you still can't trust him yet? Or is this playing out in a way that has to be done with like divine help and is waiting for Athena's word? Like, why not trust Eumaeus is my lingering question. What else in book 14, not later, what else in book 14 would Eumaeus have to do or say for Odysseus to trust him?
Right.
What else is there? I don't know the answer.
Yeah, that's good. And there's a funny telegraphing of this in the story, a detail I don't know if I ever noticed before. When Odysseus, as the beggar, is talking about his journey here, the story he's making up to tell Eumaeus how he got there today, he says, and this he works in where he heard news about Odysseus. So he plants that in his story and says, the people who were going to bring me here, I heard news of Odysseus from them who was lately a guest there, passing by on his way home. And the king said, he showed me the treasure that Odysseus had, and it was all this. But he said the man himself, Odysseus, had gone up to Dodona to ask the spelling leaves of the old oak tree, to ask of them the will of God, how to return, that is, to the rich realm of Ithaca after so long an absence, openly or on the quiet. And so he said the thing that Odysseus was eager to find out was how should he come back? Should he arrive? In what way? Should he be subtle about it? So it's to your question, it's kind of he works it into his story that's what Odysseus had been working on, consulting an oracle of some kind. It sounds like the spelling tree, which does sound like something from Hogwarts.
My French freshman could use a spelling tree. That's a different conversation.
Yeah, and not just for the will of God either. So
no.
Yeah, so that's a good point. And my lingering question is related, and my lingering question doesn't have so much to do with the plot. It's the kind of topical inspiration thing you get from reading books like this, which is what kind of world are we in? And I think some of this came to me this week. I was I have a 45-minute commute to work, to school both ways. And so I get a lot of podcasts listening in. I was listening to this podcast. These guys were talking about, they had just read Jacob Burckhardt's The Greeks and Greek Civilization. Burckhardt was a classicist that had actually been a teacher, one of Nietzsche's teachers in Germany.
Oh, wow.
So he's a very famous classicist, and
Nietzsche was considered the greatest classicist of his age, the greatest up-and-coming classicist.
Right. He gets an appointment at Cologne or wherever when he's 25 or something like this, something unheard of like that, right? So one of his teachers, Jacob Burckhardt, has this, it wasn't a book, I guess it was a collection of lectures that was published after his death. And so they were talking about this and about the view of the world that of the Greek world. And this guy who's talking, he just said, I just want to stop right here and just say the Greeks were space aliens. Okay. That's what I want to say. If someone came and said, we actually found the ship, we've got the receipts, they literally were people from a completely other planet, he goes, I would 100% believe them, because the world that they created, the world that they lived in, he said, we always get kind of the sanitized version of it. A lot of the Greek myths, that we hear are kind of sanitized. Edith Hamilton, maybe niced up, versions of Ovid's retelling of the myths. But when you really dig in to the sources, it's a complicated, weird place. And these people they are not us. They're not us. They're not our civilization, at all. And there's things that are wonderful. There's things that are horrifying. There are things that are, surprising, the whole things. And I guess that was in my head when I was thinking about this chapter. You can see some bits of it. Look at Odysseus, kind of related to what you're saying, coming back home as king. But there is this unexpected acceptance of his current position, which is as an old beggar who's been tossed about the world and has nothing. At some level, that is totally true. Set that aside. At some other level, all these herds of pigs, and Eumaeus himself, belong to him. They're all his and under his command. And from judging from Eumaeus's disposition, if Odysseus showed him the scar and said, "I'm the true man," Odysseus or Eumaeus would serve him right then, and they could get started. But Odysseus doesn't do that. Also, he doesn't turn off this conniving, driving kind of mindset, plotting mindset that he has. in the end of the book, there's a clever tale where he's getting ready to go to bed, and he determines to get a blanket. And so I got one more story for you guys. And he tells a story about how this guy Odysseus, one night, whenever he, the beggar, was sleeping outside of Troy and was about to freeze to death, and told Odysseus, man, I'm going to freeze to death. And Odysseus said, hey, don't worry about it. I'll get you a blanket. And he connives to get a blanket, sends a guy off on some bogus mission. And while that guy's off on the bogus mission, he just takes his sleeping bag, gives it to gives it to him. And Eumaeus knows exactly what's going on. He goes, that was a really good story. Perfectly told. Loved it. You'll have a blanket. Don't worry. But, if you want some clothes, forget it, because we don't have any extra. But I will give you, I'll give you this blanket. So this, I guess, to me, why Odysseus doesn't jump up and say, hey, let's get to it. I'm the king here. Let's take it back. This is mine, which is kind of what you're saying a little bit. Why he doesn't do that? Why is he still conniving, plying, trying to get, plotting, then at the same time accepting his position? He's just going to sleep on a pile of rags tonight. It is wild. It is really wild when you think about how is he thinking about himself, about who he is. Where is his, like we would say, where is his ego, in this, and how's that landing? It's extremely complex, his self-perception.
What is he scared of with this guy based on everything we know? What is he frightened of right now? That's what I'm not sure of. And in light of what you said earlier, I need to read that book, the lectures, or listen to that podcast. That's really interesting to me. I find that one of the things I love about reading, great old literature in general, but like the Iliad and the Odyssey specifically, is what you said was exactly true, that they're like aliens. And then there are moments where this could be on the news, or this could be at my Thanksgiving table, or like a really good, wise character being working class. You and I know people like that.
Yes, that's right.
I mean, name custodians you and I have worked with, and we're like, yeah, this is one of the best people on this campus, and like no one talks to him, but he's actually like this really interesting person. Or someone who works in the cafeteria or the DPW or collects your trash. Like, there's a wisdom in knowing that those people have depth.
Yeah.
And just because they're doing that job isn't necessarily a reflection of a lack of depth. The same way as someone doing our job doesn't necessarily mean that's a reflection of depth.
No, not at all. Some of them are Eumaeus, they're princes whose lives have had turns,
Right.
And it's great.
Right. That's it.
Yes. Right.
Exactly right.
And if you get sick, and I think everyone does, at some point, at some level, our students, we do as adults, you just get tired of the rules of the world you're living in, and you think, is there something more? Sometimes you're asking a bigger question, questions of good and evil and God and Satan or something. But sometimes you're just like, I'm just sick of my Monday through Friday. One of the joys, of a book, of a book like this is presenting, there's a whole different way to think about your life circumstances, and Odysseus's take on it, Eumaeus's take on it. He just walks out in the rain, sits under a rock with a blanket over his shoulders, doing his job. He doesn't even know if the man he's working for, he kind of thinks the man he's working for is dead. He kind of thinks he's probably gone. He's ready to believe it. And he's and he even tells us, don't come here with stories about Odysseus. Every traveler has them. We don't want them. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. And yet he's dutiful. So there's some inspiration in that. It gives you, and this is something you can push, in whatever way you think would succeed in your classroom, back to your students, to rethink, to keep thinking, to take back on again. And that's your own life, your own understanding of your life and your circumstances. Because Odysseus never turns that off. Like he never, that motor is always running, in his mind. He never sleeps. He never he's like a shark. He just keeps going. And there's something about that is just true about being alive in the world, You're just on. So it's an interesting perspective of the self and selfhood. It's an interesting perspective of the world and reality, of fate, of the gods, of duty. It's very complicated in this little chapter, and you can dig in it in this book 14.
Yeah.
All right. So that gets us solidly back in Ithaca. One more strange island, a slave in the forest. And then we're ready to move forward with the plot in a big way. Here, there's a lot of loose ends to kind of pull together, and then we can head down to the manor house and start confronting this big evil on the island of Ithaca.
Yeah. You hear the The Jaws theme is very quiet now, but it's gonna get louder and louder.
Yeah, that's right. That's gonna be our outro music.
Yeah, good luck.
Yeah. Well, all right. Does that cover it, Jay?
I think that's good. Thanks, Paul. I appreciate the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you too, Jay. I appreciate it. See you next time.
You too. Bye-bye.